Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Kashanipur. I want to welcome you all to Contagious Connections, a scholarly academic program focused on epidemic disease in the vast early Americas. I'm Ryan Kashanipur. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona in History and Latin American Studies, and I'm here with my colleague and friend and co-convener, Claire Guarini, to welcome you, Claire.
Hi, thank you. I'm Claire Guarini. I'm an assistant professor of history at Fordham University.
So we're very excited to begin this portion of the Contagious Connections series with the Alejandro Institute. Today is a discussion focused and a part of a larger research agenda focused on epidemic diseases in the early Americas. I'm going to start by first talking a little about the format. I'm going to talk a little about the program and what sort of the purpose of this research agenda is, and then we'll do some introductions of our scholars, and then we'll get into a conversation and have question, answer, and the like. So first, I want to say a little bit about format for our discussion. We've blocked 90 minutes here today, and we'll begin with really a moderated discussion between 6 outstanding and leading scholars in the early Americas whose work connects to epidemics. We'll then turn to about 30 minutes for sort of open conversation with the audience. We've circulated a few questions for our scholars to sort of get started. Our participants, our speakers, can jump in, should feel free to jump in with questions or comments as they might like. Audience members, you can post questions in the chat. Claire will be helping manage the chat today. I'm going to help lead and moderate the conversation. We'll read questions that come up in the chat and ask some of our authors and scholars to respond to them. This is the first of a series of events. This is the first sort of conversation with established and senior scholars whose work on epidemics we all probably know really well. We'll also continue with another session on December 17th with a whole different group of scholars. We're really excited. I'd like to say a few things about the program and what we're doing here today. So I've written it out a little bit, and I'm going to read. Epidemics were foundational forces in the early history of the Americas and the larger Atlantic world, from smallpox and typhus in the 16th century to yellow fever and malaria in the 18th. Epidemic outbreaks were constant, recurrent, and near ubiquitous aspects of life in the early modern Americas. Periodically, some diseases erupted as unpredictable, terrifying, and well-documented events. They captured the attention of elite medical officials who named them and defined them often. At other times, they simmered as endemic diseases, even everyday conditions that were experienced across society, particularly at the lowest levels. Yet, the comparative analysis of disease across time and place has often been restricted to regional and temporal priorities, often in different subfields of disciplines. Scholars of the early English Americas, for instance, have generally engaged with those working in particular locales like New England, the Mid-Atlantic, or even the Caribbean. Similarly, colonial Latin Americanists have often conferred most with those in comparable regions or periods, like early colonialists connecting with others in Peru or in Nueva España. But infectious diseases knew no such boundaries. They moved across space through human, animal, and non-animated pathways. Across the hemisphere, diseases touched people in every imperial and indigenous domain. The importance of understanding the deep and widespread nature of epidemic diseases is not new or novel, however. In fact, Noah Webster, the American lexicographer and lay observer of the 1793 yellow fever outbreak in Philadelphia, lamented the fact that relatively few studied the long history and movement and origins of epidemic diseases. He wrote, in regards to the origin and causes of pestilence, the subject is not understood. While much has changed since Webster's era, the need to explore the importance of epidemic disease in the early Americas remains. In fact, our current dare I say, never-ending experiences with a pandemic turned epidemic come endemic experience of COVID-19 serves as an ongoing reminder about the importance of understanding the history of diseases from personal experience, collective experience, from the ground and from above. Contagious Connections, this program aims to address some of these issues, and we're really thrilled to be working with the Alejandro Institute on this. We aim to talk across imperial and disciplinary divides, moving out of our respective silos to broaden our approaches and methods. We hope to highlight the importance of understanding diseases as experiential occurrences and epistemological forces. We also aim to consider the ways that biological phenomena of diseases intersected with sociocultural experiences, what Charles Rosenberg once called the disease as frame kind of model of analysis. We're thrilled today to be joined by 6 outstanding leading scholars of early American history to discuss the field, to discuss how they approach researching the context, the period, and diseases. They work in a wide variety of arenas and regions. So with that, I'd like to introduce each of them. I have them alphabetically. We'll start with Martha Few. Martha Few is professor of history and women's studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, at Penn State University. She's the editor of the Hispanic American Historical Review, and her research concentrates on the histories of indigenous peoples during Spanish colonial rule in Guatemala, Central America, and Southern Mexico. She uses lenses of medicine and public health, gender and sexuality, and environmental history. We all probably know her work through For All Humanity and a recent book on cesarean sections. Also like to welcome Martha. I'd like to also welcome Mark Goldberg. Mark is Associate Professor of History and Director of Jewish Studies of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Houston. His research focuses on US Latinx history, borders, and immigration. His book, Conquering Sickness, examines the role of health in imperial expansion, nation building, race formation in the Texas-Mexico border region. Pablo Gomez is an associate professor in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics and the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His first book, Experiential Caribbean, examines the ways that the experiences of people across the Caribbean, particularly those of African descent in the 17th century, serve to create systems of knowledge about the body and nature. He also has a new wonderful edited volume with Diego Armus called The Gray Zones of Medicine, which deals with healers in Latin American history, which I've assigned to my honors class next semester probably. Paul Kelton also joins us. Paul is professor and Gardner Chair in American History at Stony Brook University. He researches the indigenous peoples of North America, environment and medicine, and early American history. He's examined the biological processes involved in the European takeover of the Americas in 2 books, Epidemics and Enslavement and Cherokee Medicine, Colonial Germs, which locate struggles with epidemics within large-scale contexts of colonialism, social disruption, structural violence, and political upheaval. We're also joined by Pippa Cook, who is an assistant professor of religious studies at Missouri State University. Her research and teaching center on religion, health, and society in early America and its global context. Her first book, The Course of God's Providence, considers how 18th century Christians perceive sickness and health in an era of rapid changes in medicine and science. And finally, Eric Seaman joins us. Eric is a professor and chair in the history department at the University of Buffalo. Eric is a historian of religion in early America and the Atlantic world. He's the author of numerous books, 4 books and numerous articles, including Death in the New World, and his most recent book, Speaking with the Dead in Early America. He's currently working on a book project on Boston's pox of 1721. Very excited. We're very excited to have all of these scholars here with us today, as well as a large audience. So welcome to you all. So we'll start here now. I'm just going to open things up, and I'm going to ask, we have some questions we've all sort of thought about, but I'm going to toss them out. And so we have some questions that are very focused, some questions that are sort of broad reaching. What I'd like to do is start with kind of maybe something we've all been thinking about. The impetus for sort of this conversation at some level has to do with our current experiences with COVID-19. So if I could, I'm going to ask Martha. Martha, can you talk about the ways that recent global localized experiences with an epidemic pandemic has shaped your own thinking about your own work and your own research?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. I'll just throw a couple of things out there, and I'm sure other people will probably see similar things and different things as well. But for me, kind of underscoring the connection between my own work in colonial Mesoamerica and the Maya region, and thinking about today is that the impact of pandemics in the past and today is always unequal. It's spatially uneven. It's exacerbated by existing racial, class and gender inequalities and other kinds of inequalities. And that's really clear, at least that's what a lot of the evidence for looking at some of the first smallpox inoculation and vaccination campaigns in Maya communities in late colonial Guatemala show, and you can see that today as well. One thing that I think is also interesting to kind of bring up is thinking about indigenous responses, indigenous practices, and healing cultures, both today and in the past, as being important to take into consideration. If we look at the Navajo Nation, for example, even before state and national policies about quarantines and sort of social assistance to its members were kind of organized by the state, they were organizing their own, which I thought was interesting. And we can see similar kinds of things in the colonial period where communities are actively learning, indigenous communities are learning how to inoculate and then inoculating their own people. We can also see about how indigenous medical practices in my area, temazcales, which are medical ritual healing steam baths, were used, but were also seen as suspect by state authorities. And finally, thinking a little bit about that I'd like to do more with is thinking about animals and how they connect with humans and the natural world in my own work, looking at medicinal beetles and other kinds of animal materials that were used in treatments, but also can be thought about in terms of vectors of transmission. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Martha. I wonder, thinking about this indigenous side of it, I wonder if I might pull in Paul here in particular to think about sort of different contexts for indigenous people. So Martha working mainly with Maya peoples, Central America, Southern Mexico. Paul, I wonder if you might.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, what I've been impressed by is, and I think our current experience exemplifies this real well, is the power of sovereignty. And indigenous peoples such as the Navajo and Lakota reservations in South Dakota are attempting to control travel in and out of the reservation, build solidarity among their people, running their own health networks. And it just illustrates, I think, so well, conversely, what the absence of control means, which we see in the colonial period. Whereas, what I've written about is indigenous peoples who are struggling for that control amid a new environment in which their control is being taken away. And now it's gratifying to see, particularly the Navajo, but also I think the Cheyenne River reservation shutting itself off from, or at least I shouldn't say shutting itself off, but patrolling traffic across the reservation, and of course getting into trouble with the South Dakota governor and Trump on that. But it illustrates, I think, in many ways, just this ongoing struggle of indigenous peoples to retain their sovereignty and how essential sovereignty is to health and well-being. So that's the one takeaway I would throw out there.
Well, I wonder if I might ask, how about other subjugated peoples? Pablo, I'm thinking about your work in particular, and how free and enslaved African peoples experienced not just epidemics, but just more broadly disease and these broader conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Can you hear me? Thanks. Yeah, one of the things that keeps coming back to mind as we endure the pandemic over the past year and a half is the fact that these types of crises that they seem to us as so novel in our experiences of living and thinking about the world is actually what define life for many communities, and specifically we're thinking about people of African descent and enslaved people in the world of the Caribbean. This was life for them, a life that was shaped by Middle Passage, that was shaped by outbreaks of epidemics within both port cities on West and West Central Africa, but also in the Caribbean itself, in the ships themselves. In other words, a space of disease and death that it seems that we have discovered, and that we think about it in terms of a type of crisis that has not happened before, or only happened in certain specifically historically defined spaces. And I think that this was a way of life, and this was what shaped these people's communities. And I'm thinking here of new work by Elise Michel that was just finished up a wonderful dissertation in which she's making that argument, right, that you need to link, right, like think about slavery and enslavement, right, like, as a way of thinking about pandemics and epidemics, that those two things that she's working on smallpox specifically, they are intrinsically linked. So thinking with how people think about the world, we also think about new periodizations, new chronologies for these sort of trajectories of disease that do not depend on the markers of Euro-American milestones, right, like of pandemics, epidemics, and mobilizations across the Atlantic, right? Like the chronologies, the geographies, the way of thinking about this they are completely different. I have more things to say, but I wanted just to throw that out there as a way of starting thinking about these issues.
Yeah, we still are informed in many ways by the nation, right? But imperial boundaries, and those often still set our chronologies. Mark, I wonder if you might pull you in thinking about so-called borderlands, right? Thinking about Texas experience.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the study of epidemics, or not even just epidemics, but the study of disease, health, and well-being, like everyone's been saying, provides these opportunities to think about history in ways bigger than the nation state, or that reframe traditional categories about thinking of history. And I guess the thing that drove me to study the Texas-Mexico border was that in the 18th and 19th century, it saw like multiple regime changes within a relatively short period of time. And in my work, I'm interested in well, I use medicine to talk about the production of racial knowledge. And what was striking is, well, the way that we think about race and racism often is within a nation-centered framework, and it makes sense to understand the way race operates. But what was striking is that across these regimes, there were certain similarities in terms of the way that race was defined medically. And part of the reason why had to do with, I'm looking at physicians and scientists, and they see themselves as part of a profession that also just is bigger than the nation state, and it's a global profession. And so there was conversation across international borders about medicine and medical practice. And so even though the language of race played itself out specifically in different ways based on place, at the same time, there are commonalities around the way physicians use the language of race to use the language of medicine to talk about race, and the way that kind of trickled down into everyday society. So I see the study of disease as this opportunity to think about, I guess, traditional categories in bigger ways.
We want to follow up on that specifically. I think there's a lot of through lines here that we've picked up on. I wonder, I might ask kind of a question about going back to something that kind of came up earlier about our own subjects. Eric, I want to ask you about this. How do our historical subjects, particularly your subjects that you look at, consider disease and the relationship to environment and sustenance, climate, all these sorts of things? How do they understand these relationships?
Thanks. So, so as you mentioned, I'm writing about Boston's 1721 smallpox epidemic, which is not a particularly original subject. In fact, along with Philadelphia's 1793 yellow fever epidemic, is probably the most written about epidemic in all of the early Americas. Whereas other scholars are really focusing on, have always focused on the inoculation controversy, I'm trying to write a social history of the epidemic. And so I'm really interested in just exactly that question you asked. How do non-elites conceptualize the relationship between environment and disease? How does everybody really, including elites, conceptualize that relationship? I think it's really telling that the smallpox arrives in Boston on aboard a ship that came from Salta Tortuga, as they sometimes refer to it, or La Tortuga, a small island off of Venezuela, Salt Island, arrived in April 22nd of 1721. And just a month later, May 24th, the city put to work all free blacks and mulattoes to clean the streets of dirt, because it was understood that dirt in the streets would help spread smallpox. So these black and mulatto men, free men, are their labor is requisitioned to for 6 days. Each of them had to put in to get rid of the dirt on the street. And so you might think that that would lead to a connection between dirt and persons of color and disease that you see later in American history, but it doesn't quite play out that way, because the residential segregation in 18th century Boston was not as sharply defined as it would become in most North American cities by the 19th century. You don't have quite that connection, but there is this won't surprise anyone that there's an understanding that dirt brings with it disease. The mechanism isn't always particularly clearly spelled out. There's an understanding or belief that cold weather is bad for smallpox because it prevents the pustules from forming properly. And if the pustules don't form properly, then it'll lead to a worse outcome than if it does, than if they do. So they're constantly kind of investigating the environment for evidence about what will that they can use, that they can instrumentalize. But I guess if I could dissent a little bit from the sort of implied position behind your first question, which was about what we've learned from today about the past, I guess that implies that I don't know, there's things about today's epidemic that we can apply to the past. I think I mean, obviously what everyone said makes a lot of sense, and there are definitely connections, but I just see so many differences between in the 18th century there, that if we think that today we understand what it feels like to go through a pandemic, I think we don't really understand what it feels like to go through one in the 17th or 18th century, and the lack of understanding and knowledge and fear. I don't know, I just feel like it was very different then as compared to today.
I see a lot of heads nodding, including my own. Others want to chime in on that last point there. Pippa, what do you think?
I think that I'm currently in quarantine, and it's a lot different, obviously, than what it would have been like in the 18th century. I can get food delivered to my house, with a touch of my thumb on my smartphone. So, you know, there's obvious differences. On the other hand, like I do think that I've learned to sort of attend to certain things differently about my subjects that I wasn't paying attention to before. I always imagined the quarantine would be hard, but I think it's a lot harder now. One thing that's really struck me recently that because I spent a little bit of time on the inoculation controversy in Boston in my book. One thing I've noticed in current debates over the vaccine and like people who are trying to unvaccinate or devaccinate themselves is sort of questions of bodily purity that I find really striking now that I look back on how people responded to inoculation in the past, and concerns about what sort of the corruption that, and they called it that, you know, why would you intentionally insert this corruption into your body? And so for me, I've been thinking a lot more about how people imagine, you know, their bodies and purity, and sort of the wholeness of their bodies and the integrity of their bodies, actually, in light of some of the contemporary claims about these issues. And it's totally different. I think Eric is right. Like they're not speaking quite the same language, or really the same language at all, but it is making me think really differently about my historical subjects. And I would just add one other thing. I think this is connected to race in some ways. Thinking about how people claim the right to narrate epidemics and tell stories about epidemics is something that is a connection, I think, between now and the past, and the power that comes with telling a sort of account about what happened, right? And blaming, you know, people for what happened, or saying, you know, or claiming that you've improved something. That's something that I see historically in epidemics in the past, and that is certainly occurring in the present.
Thinking about bodies, thinking about distinctions, and sensitivity to the present being different than the past, and it not avoiding upstream. I wonder if we might think more about sort of bodies in particular. Pablo, I'm thinking about your work, Martha as well. Centrality there, and also what Pippa talked about, sort of the narrative aspects of epidemics as well. I've been wondering a lot about sort of, you know, the connection between epidemics, these explosive things, and then, you know, the fundamental substrate of diseases being a part of the everyday world. Where do bodies fit?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I was about to chime in and say that there in those linkages, and I totally agree with what both Eric and Philippa just said, right? Like, the assumptions behind a set of interpretations and living through a pandemic also come from a very historical positioning, right, of thinking of subjectivity, right, like, and thinking about individuality, and thinking about inhabiting a political and social space that has that is really relatively recent, and that in many ways takes us away also not only from that sense of being in the world, right, like as a subject, but also embodiment. And I think the ideas about the universality of embodiment are also very problematic. And we know these, right? Like, and many historians have explored this in important ways. But how you think, how you conceive of the world, right? Like, and how do you conceive of the afflictions that are that basically shaped your existence, also define in many ways political, social positionalities. That's what it's also I was referring to in the past about, like, the relationship between, for instance, not only enslavement, but living in communities that are shaped by sort of living with disease that are very different from our own experiences. So I have serious suspicions, right, about the idea that what we are living today, it is akin to a world that it was not globalized, that it was not shaped in any way by capitalism. And I'm mentioning this because the concept of the plague itself, the concept of pandemics, is a relatively new concept. This is not something that people were thinking of in the 18th, 19th century. Historically, we're talking about the 20th century, and it's like even the projections into ancient histories that allow us to think from our vantage points, right? Like globalized, shaped by capitalism, about these historical events and their emergence, right, in historical narratives, which is what also Philippa was saying. The fact that we live right now, that we inhabit these bodies, that we live in this world, ask us to make certain claims about the past that are important politically, but that is also true about our historical subjects, and they certainly do not share any of these ways of thinking and being. So something to contribute here to what both Philippa and Eric just said.
Maybe I can build on that a little bit too. And for me, one of the things that particularly struck me for the late 18th century in looking at sort of the first state-directed campaigns against what were being called epidemics by colonial doctors and authorities and things like that was the way that bodies again become central to colonialism, where it's not just control over bodies for slavery and labor. It's not just control over souls for religious conversion, but now the medical professionals, they've been around before. There's universities, but they become the sort of drivers and creators of the ideology around and the practices around having these anti-epidemic campaigns for inoculation and later vaccination, but also anti-typhus campaigns and other kinds of diseases that there really aren't cures for yet, but they center around the kind of expansion from colonial centers into, at least in my Maya areas, not my Maya areas, but the Maya areas where there's no real colonial presence yet, aside from parish priests and things like that. All of a sudden you have these medical campaigns, they're bringing military officers, they're bringing regional officials who are coming in. And so it becomes this implicit opportunity for reinforcement of colonial authority and power now around medicine and medical professionals.
Ryan, can I follow up real quick? It's just a question actually for other panelists, and this is something that I've been thinking, right? Like, one way of thinking about like our current experience is that the survivors of many of these catastrophes, especially here in the Americas, they're walking among us. There are all these communities of Native Americans, and I was just thinking about your work, Paul and Martha, right? Like, and Philippa, right? They have deep historical memories that go kind of not exactly along the same lines of what we as historians build, right? Like, so how do you engage with that historical memory in living, right? Like thinking now about living in the present, right? Like, because they do have a sort of experience and embodiment that do not follow what might be visible, right? Like to historians working on Euro-American Academy. So I just wanted to pose that question because I was just thinking about it as you were talking, Martha.
Paul, do you want to jump in there? Think about historical memory.
Well, one, I think it teaches us the importance of our own scholarship. I mean, we're talking, if we are narrating some of these epidemics and how they might get interpreted both by natives and non-natives, it's important and to be sensitive and hopeful that our work is important to those we write about. In terms of indigenous memories of epidemics, I'm actually just finished a piece for Centaurus on the end of smallpox in Indian country, and which I didn't know really when it ended until I started investigating this. It was around the turn of the 20th century with a mass vaccination campaign, public health campaign. But part of my research, I wanted to look at indigenous oral history that was delivered by people that actually might have been vaccinated or lived through the vaccination period, and whether they said anything about vaccination. I found zero. But what I did find is a lot of discussion about the introduction of smallpox and how deadly it was. And so when you think, a milestone in their history, the elimination of a certain disease would prominently, it didn't happen. And instead, smallpox became a marker for the beginning of unending trauma, unending colonialism. And I think that whether it's smallpox or removal or enslavement or any other trauma, that lives in memory. And that certainly has, I think, influenced the COVID response of a number of indigenous groups today, that they don't have to They didn't have to do much convincing. The Dene did not have to do much convincing people to take the vaccinations. Whereas, where I'm from, rural Oklahoma, a number of Cherokees had surplus vaccine. The Cherokee Nation gave surplus to neighboring whites and African Americans who didn't readily accept it. So those historical memories, we play a role, I think, in illustrating that to an academic audience and a popular audience, and we need to be very, very aware of that.
Looking around the room, others want to come in. I'm going to ask, Mark, are constructions of race parts of those historical memories of experiences, maybe not just with epidemics, but with conditions of disease and disparity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that speaks to what has been said that is related to the past and present is the way, I mean, Martha, Paul, and Pablo have been explaining the way in which medical professionals operated as colonial agents, right? And that's part of that memory that Paul's talking about too. And so I think that one of the important things nowadays, and this is something that I think plays out in the classroom for me, is talking about practitioners within the structures of power, certainly in the past, but also in the present. And how do communities and populations and particularly marginalized communities respond to physicians that exist within those structures of power. And so I think this question of memory has to do with the position of physicians as colonial agents.
I think it's important too that a lot of these physicians in the colonial world were accompanying missionary enterprises. And so alongside the sort of political or imperial power that medical authorities, whatever sort of level of authority had, they also were bringing often very sort of Christian norms of the body and suffering along with them, that did affect and understandings of race in the long term, and that's part of that story that's part of it's a political story as well, but I think the religious side is a crucial aspect of that.
Awkward Zoom pauses here to make sure people can come in as they might like. Let me ask maybe a historical methodological question. I want to get back to something that came up earlier, a couple of things, lots of fascinating threads, but how do we see some of this in the source, right? So this question about historical memory, about indigenous peoples, about, many of our records are by state actors, right? If we're thinking about the role of physicians here and missionaries, is there attaches or vice versa? How do we see this? How do we read in the sources? How do we get to this? There's questions about epistemology and ontology here, but just at a practical level, how do we do it? How do you do it in your work, Pablo?
Yeah, Ryan, this actually relates to what we have been discussing, right? Like, I think that it is not only about what the sources provide, obviously, right? Like, it is also the kind of questions that we ask, but also the epistemologists around which we frame, right, like our inquiries. And I'm saying that because it relates to the walking away from assumptions about what the history of disease can give us, right? Like, and what the history of disease can relate to, right? Like, and if you are kind of moving away from history of disease or epidemics that centers around both universal concepts of disease or anachronistic notions of disease itself as going back in the past, and look at that, what we have been discussing here, the lived experience of embodiment as a part of a political and social world, right? Like you start asking questions that might be answered through sources that go beyond narratives of either the plague, tables of mortality, morbidity, or the kind of accounts of doctors that are part of the colonial projects that Philippa was mentioning, the same thing with Paul. And then you start asking questions that appear in other spaces. And that include, of course, in my own work, I made use of records that many people have used for what we'll consider to be religious histories, right? Like both Inquisition and ecclesiastical records of different sorts. But it goes beyond that. And I think it speaks to what Paul was talking about before. Engagement with historical memory in a serious methodological way and methodical way, right? Like that, again, thinks not only in terms of different approaches to sources, but thinks about different, not only chronologies, but geographies, because that is our theme. And I think you mentioned this too, Brian, the idea of the nation state as shaping what we consider to be the boundaries of what we do. And I think that is also crucial here, right? Like walking away from those questions and what can be considered important or belonging to the history of disease, but also where the history of disease can go. And I think that that's something that has been changing radically over the past few years, right? Like what and how is that we think of history of bodies, illness, what realms do they touch upon? So when you're thinking, and now with this, I will stop, but when you are thinking, for instance, about my historical actors and the ways in which they are dealing with disease itself, you think about creativity is not only about that space of destruction, of obliteration, but how do you create power from within, right? Like, which is what I did in my first book. How do you, out of a world that seems to be so bleak, you create spaces for the construction of community, which is what these historical actors in the 20th century did. But also, and this is something I'm exploring in my new project, how do you, through disease and through ideas about disease, you also think about entering a realm and playing with the realm, which is what all of our historical actors did. In this case, for instance, of the Spanish or Portuguese empires, and asking for different legal strategies for, asking for manumission, for instance, right? Like, for engaging with the world, right, in ways that it would have been impossible to do so. So disease is not only about destruction. Disease is not only about decimation. It is also about building up, and people are, creating from within. So, but that implies asking different questions of the sources that we have, right? Like, I'm not saying the sources do not give us. The sources do give us. It's just like you need to ask differently.
Diseases as creating community, others see that in their work. Couple of things there, that is one question. The other question about sort of just the movement of these things, right? And the ways to get beyond our imperial boundaries. Eric, you talked about, oh, go ahead, Martha.
I was just going to say, I think one of the things that kind of surprised me in my own work was the extent to which medical doctors engaging in these campaigns against smallpox and typhus and other diseases depended on their relations with indigenous healers and elites, including men and women, both some of these were mediated by local parish priests because there was language issues of, these medical physicians weren't able to speak the indigenous languages, but in terms of, it also kind of relates to what Pablo was saying, is like the kinds of questions we can ask, even of sources like smallpox inoculation handbooks that on the surface might seem to be just like, just straight, this is how it happened, but you can find in there evidence of some of that collaboration that was absolutely necessary to successfully introduce inoculation to a different kind of ethnic cultural group. And for me, it kind of came up in particular where one of the medical physicians in my work noticed that parents and their children were afraid of the medical of the European style lancet, and so they we don't know how this happened, but this medical doctor in these how-to manuals advocated for the use of chayas, which are Maya medical cutting instruments made from obsidian and other things and they cut very well. And these were what indigenous bloodletters used in this area. And so you can start seeing little bits of evidence like that and begin to pull together how both different kinds of questions we can ask our sources, but also this idea of creation of creating this medical system that might on the surface seem completely colonial or completely European, but actually it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. Martha, if I may, I mean, I'm thinking about the work of Farangero here too, right? Like that the work that implies, right, like the thinking about through epidemics and smallpox vaccination, gender, reproductive politics, in ways that again, asking questions different from sources that might seem to only give us a little bit, it just like give us a completely different world.
Eric, I saw you there. Go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to jump in and build on what Martha and Pablo were saying about the use of sources. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I'm working on 18th century Boston, so there's lots of sources. But similar to the way that Pablo used Inquisition records so fantastically, I really admire your book, Pablo, and what you are able to draw from those sources by reading them for materials that weren't central to the purpose of the inquisitors oftentimes. So I've been able to use court records in Boston, and there's a number of suits that are filed in the years after the smallpox epidemic, trying to recover costs from people who sought out the help of apothecaries, but then couldn't found themselves unable to pay. So the descriptions in those sources are really rich. And one of the things I've been able to start to try to uncover is some of the invisible aspects of the epidemic. So for example, nursing care that was typically provided by women and or family members, female family members, that's just not part of the vast source record left by the ministers and in the newspapers about the inoculation controversy. So similarly, using those kinds of sources, like Martha was talking about, finding those native analogs to the Lancet or whatever, places that have been invisible in previous tellings of these epidemics, to try to find those sources to read against the grain and find the examples to support that.
Others want to talk about reading sources, ways to move beyond. Paul, go ahead.
Well, I think, we have a tendency as historians to fill in silences in the sources with a lot of speculation when it comes to disease. And I'm sure I've been guilty of that. But I think it's our role to kind of evaluate different speculations that are going on. An example would be, it seems to me that indigenous peoples in North America overwhelmingly accept vaccination. There's some examples of resistance, and I talked a little bit about that in my Cherokee medicine book. Probably kind of skewed it more towards the resistance, but yet there was a lot of acceptance too. But the more I study it, but why? I mean, and that's a silence in the archive. And I think it would, in the bad old days, it would have simply been filled in with, well, because it's progress, it's medical science, but now we know that it certainly wasn't that. So I guess my question is, I need to read, all you guys' stuff, because it sounds like you're doing some wonderful work, and I know you, from what I read, you guys are, and filling in those gaps. And I think that would be very productive for us to think about. What's our role in filling in the silences or dealing with the silences?
I think this is such a hard question, because and I work mostly with textual sources, right? now, or in my first project, I will admit. Epidemic sources, textual sources are a lot of them are coming from public authorities, ministers, and I mean there's bits and pieces in private accounts, but what I have found is that people write much more about everyday sickness. If you look in the historical archive and you're looking for sickness, you're going to find an overabundance of sources on sickness, just run of the mill to cancer, right? All sorts of sickness, and those sources really inform in an interesting way the sort of the way you can then read epidemic accounts, right? So they're different events, and yet at the same time they're talking about their bodies. They're talking about different medical sort of interventions they're making, or healing interventions, and they're talking about what it means to them, and what they're talking about their families, and they're preparing for death, and Eric's work is so pivotal on that topic. So I think that epidemic sources and accounts are really rich and wonderful, but if you read them in conversation with sort of more everyday accounts, a richer picture emerges that doesn't fill in the silences that Paul is so right to tell us to attend to, but yet give us a little bit more context.
Just a note here for folks in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll get to them. I want to say, I think I'm hearing there's a lot of skepticism well, let me rephrase that. There's some concern about sort of using contemporary notions and upstreaming and placing it on, locating on people in the past. There's questions about what is an epidemic, right, versus endemic disease. I wonder, how do we, so I want to think about how we as scholars of the past connect with other scholars, particularly today. How do historians talk with people in the sciences and medical humanities? How do we connect? There's often assumptions about sort of these finite, distinctive diseases as these known quantities, which we often find hard to see in the past. So how do we talk to people in the sciences and medical humanities about the importance of history and the different contexts of it? I want to jump in on that. I know Pablo, this is part of your job, I believe, but I think we all do it, right? I suspect everybody here has been brought into conversations directly because of COVID-19 about, hey, we want to think about the past. But so put that question out there. How do we talk to people in the sciences?
I guess I'll jump in, and the play, I mentioned this before, but I think the place where I've had this conversation the most is in the classroom. The first time I taught a medical history class, the very first day, it was in history, but it was also part of this medical humanities minor in the university, and the majority of the students were pre-health professions. And the very first day, a pre-med student asked me, how is this relevant to my career as a doctor? And so I answered it also the way I was talking about before, about thinking about the way patients perceive practitioners. And Houston is a global city and in itself, and then people come from around the world to the Texas Medical Center in Houston. And also I should say that the majority of our graduates, significant majority of our graduates stay in the area. So I was thinking about his question in a Houston context, and yeah, I just think when you're in such an international city, and you're going from one examination room to another, and you're dealing with patients that certainly have diverse medical worldviews, that I think it's important for a med student to think about how this patient might understand their own bodies and well-being and medicine. I should say the student didn't return. I don't know if it had anything to do with me, but that is what happened. And then another place where I've dealt with this is It was probably also it might have been a STEM student, but when I've talked about Mexican American history and I talk about my work in terms of the way that also there's this conflict and contact between medical worldviews in Texas around, say, curanderos and physicians. And so I contextualize both practitioners within the societies in which they lived in, I'm talking about the way physicians perceived curanderismo and appropriated it, but also distanced themselves from it, and that sometimes has been automatically read as me critiquing medical science. That seems to come up sometimes, like when you're talking about medical history and you're contextualizing physicians in this way, this assumption that, I don't know, you'd prefer to live in the 19th century medical world. I don't know. But I think that's a bigger question also about the relevance of history, right? Talking to students about what the past has to say about the present, and placing or thinking about science not as a subjective truth, but part of this, these social and cultural and political contexts in which we live.
I'll answer Ryan real quick. So I am finishing up, I just finished up last week a course on, it's called Outbreak, Epidemic Disease in Historical Context for medical students that are finishing up in the 4th year. That course, we designed it before COVID-19. So I'm kind of afraid now designing any course, being afraid that somehow is going to summon other sort of plague of pestilence upon us. But one thing that has been fascinating about it is that the ways in which medical students you will think are going to be inured or somehow very hesitant to engage and think, or to think historically, right, about, especially they are finishing up, right, like medical school, they are doing interviews for residency. And what surprises me, especially compared to undergrads, is that once you have been in the medical world, once you have been in the everyday practice of the clinic, you understand that the lessons probably that history can bring to you are not so much so about, the specificity around like how disease operated in the past, or how historical actors, how somehow the lessons, right, of the past that many people think when we're well, undergrads especially, and this is something that Mark was talking about, but rather the sensibility about the different worlds, the incommensurability sometimes that the patients bring into the clinic itself, right? Like how the world of public health is one that assumes a certain kind of patterns and ideas about population that simply do not translate. So that sensitivity, that sensibility, right, like it's something that they really appreciated. It was very productive to them because of course, we were talking about the 1918 influenza pandemic. We were talking about the smallpox, and the bubonic plague in San Francisco, and smallpox epidemics and yellow fever pandemics in Boston, in Philadelphia. The sort of history that Eric has been working on, and many others here. But as much as they recognize that certain patterns occur, what stuck with them, the takeaway was, we really need to start thinking about people as they come with their own worlds into our, clinics, rather than thinking about like stereotypes of, ethnic or cultural kind of check boxes that I can think of, right? Like there are I don't know, Latinx, or they are African American, they're from a place in the north part of Wisconsin. They have to think like this about disease. People bring their own ontology into the I'm quoting here Anna Maria Moll, right? Like the famous philosopher, right? Like, but it is true. People bring their own ontology into the clinic. So that is one thing that was being very interesting about thinking with students that are living through the pandemic and thinking about the past.
Just would add, since I find my home in a religious studies department, I end up teaching bioethics, and which is not a natural fit for me. But I find it really, actually, having a background in early America, incredibly useful to pick apart bioethical principles like autonomy or justice. Justice in particular, right? As several of us have pointed out, the question about equitable access to healthcare is something that is a wonderful topic to explore through sources from early America, through colonial sources, right? And questions of autonomy and the limitations that are placed on people's autonomy are also fabulous to explore in historical contexts. And I think students can get that, right? And particularly like what Pablo said, when you have students who've already had some experience practicing medicine, I think they understand that these kinds of decisions that they have to make when they encounter a person who's not just a walking stereotype, but who lives in these rich contexts that we may not fully understand, but we can listen. It's a really, I think early America actually offers us a wide abundance of resources for thinking about how complicated ethics are in our present moment.
And if I may jump in just real quick here, I think this is very important, especially for a panel that is made out of people working in the pre-modern world. This is a question that we get all the time, like, how, why does, and it's precisely what you were saying, Felipe, in that foreignness, right? Like there's a recognition of the foreignness in which we live today. And I think that that connection and making sure that people understand that any sort of assumptions about fundamental understandings of how we experience the world are really problematic. So even in their foreigners, or precisely because of its foreigners, there is a lot of value in what we study, and what makes students question, right, about their own assumptions about how they inhabit the world. So just wanted to follow up real quick on that.
Great. Well, I'll say one thing I want to acknowledge. I have benefited, I inherited a course designed by Martha, History of Epidemics, here at the University of Arizona, which has been, as you might expect, overrunning with students. And students are, I'll just from my own perspective, ready to challenge sort of, you know, these essentialist kind of biological ontologies. They're ready to think about their own subjectivities and think about their own experiences and challenge in the sort of the overarching sort of narratives about what we might think about as biopower and the like. So great. So I think we're at a point here, I'm watching the clock, where we can open up for audience questions and answers. Before we close, I'm going to ask you all about things you've been reading. Maybe there was a comment earlier about you know what we need to read. I got a whole stack of things here, but we'll close the very end about any reading recommendations from our authors here. But I'd like to sort of shift to questions from audience members. Claire, do we have some that?
Yeah, we have several great questions. So I'll start with Christopher Talarico's question. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. As mentioned in the opening, disease, epidemics, pandemics, etc., are all historical foundations, but disease are by definition a natural occurrence. Should historians start thinking about diseases and other forms of nature as having historical agency and being primary drivers of historical actions? Ooh, great question.
I'll take a stab at that if that's okay. Actually, I push back a little bit on that, and I would suggest that epidemics are very much human creations. Obviously, nature has agency, viruses have agency, bacteria has agencies. But for viruses and bacteria to get from point A to point B, there has to be human agency. And I think the early American period is, you know, there's many examples of this. Settlement, the enslavement of African peoples and the Middle Passage and plantations, spreading malaria and yellow fever. And I think the tenant, you know, we, in our conversations with you know, pre-medical students or medical scientists or doctors, they may tend to think of disease as more of kind of a natural phenomenon than a historical phenomenon. So I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know of historians that, that do we overemphasize diseases as historical creations? Maybe we do. Maybe we need to think that one scholar that I read, when she was Monica Green in her reconstruction of bubonic plague, she makes some kind of saying, well, humans doing human things. And it made me think, was like, well, when can we as humans not trade or move or do these things that we do? And that's just kind of a given. And so maybe diseases are more of a natural phenomenon than we give them credit for. But I think the fight and the struggle, that the bigger fight and struggle is kind of the deterministic narratives of diseases running like wildfire, or essentialist arguments about certain groups being more vulnerable because of their inherent biology. Those have been the more dangerous interpretations that we've had to battle with a more historically grounded understanding of disease.
I think natural is kind of a dangerous word too. In my work on childbirth and maternity in the 18th century, natural and sort of nature's design is used to replace what was formerly religious language, about God's design or providence. And so it's pretty natural, depending on the time period you're looking at, can have a lot of connotations that are, as Paul has pointed out already, rooted in human understanding and, and human ontology, right? And so I think you have to use great care. And I understand that's not what the questioner meant when he suggested natural, but I do think that we have to be cautious as we adopt different paradigms in terms of thinking where they are coming from.
One way of taking that question is to think more broadly about the space that we occupy, right? Like within material world that is not only defined, right, like by what we like to believe is mankind and what we create, right? Like that we are dependent on natural processes. And I totally agree with Philippa, right? Like the idea of nature itself is one, and the differentiation between nature or culture is one that historians and anthropologists have been working on for a couple of decades now. We understand that this emerges out of the 17th century, right? And out of a specific process that also create what Stefan Palmier calls analytical interfaces, right? Like the ways in which we study those histories. So I totally agree with you. But I think that what the question is also pointing out is how do we situate human beings within a larger space of beings, right? Like, and of living entities, right? Like, and living and non-living entities, and what are the importance of thinking more broadly, right? Like, and not as isolated. And I will take it in that way. I think absolutely, right? Like, is the big lessons, right? For instance, of decades of scholarship from environmental history, right? Again, for instance. But I will say that I totally agree with what Paul was saying before. I think the danger of thinking, and I'm going to reiterate something that I said before, even the idea of plagues as ahistorical agents is one that emerges out of scientists' analysis in the early 20th century, for instance, the Justinian Plague, right? Like, this is not something that we've been thinking for a long time. So it comes from a specific, positivist narrative about the material world. And the problem with that is that in making claims about the kind of somehow detached nature of epidemics and pandemics, we take away what is actually producing and catalyzing, right, like the possibilities for epidemics and pandemics to occur, which are issues of, globalization, enslavement, violence of all sorts, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the things that we have been talking about today. So I think that is something that needs to be at the center of thinking about the viruses or bacteria as having some sort of agency, a word that it is also problematic in itself, right? Like it's a word that also emerges out of a certain sense of, as I was also mentioning before, an understanding of our own being in the world that also only emerges in the Euro-America in the 18th, 19th century. It is not even something that it is common to human beings. So just to also to point that out. So I think that is, if you are thinking broadly about environment and thinking broadly about the world of living beings, is a question that certainly needs to be taken into account, but it has dangers, as Paul mentioned, and Philippa.
Okay. I'm going to move on to our next question, which is from Patricia Murrieta, who says, could you please talk a little bit more about the recording of remedies in historical sources? More specifically, what are the associations between plants, spirituality, and the body?
Well, I think there's an awkward silence, so maybe I'll jump in. I was going to call on somebody else. Would that be all right? I think Mark needs to talk a little bit about this, but I will say I'm working on a cholera project right now, and in the 1830s. And among Euro-Americans, it just amazes me how many recipes go around that about how to fight cholera. Surprisingly, I found very little in terms of Euro-American Protestants, in Kentucky or New York or Virginia or wherever, saying much about spirituality. But more, it's like they're recipes. It's one drop of camphor, the laudanum, and just add all these up in a certain percentage, and this will cure you. Whereas in my Cherokee medicine book, I found it very interesting that to this day, much of what is written in the Cherokee syllabary are medical formulas. And what I tried to do there is show that I didn't really do it. I mean, I just kind of mentioned it in passing in the conclusion, thinking maybe grad students come along someday and develop that a little further, particularly someone that could read the syllabary, that Sequoia's invention became readily adopted by medicine people, and they're writing down their medical formulas while Euro-American missionaries are trying to erase culture. And so the remedies become a way of cultural survival to this day. And it's I never really thought about it until this question. So good question, kind of contrasting that with farmers in Kentucky writing about how much mercury to take for cholera.
Can I maybe jump in here as well? It probably also depends on the kinds of sources. I know Pablo's used Inquisition records, and an earlier project before working on anti-epidemic campaigns, I found that in Inquisition records and ecclesiastical prosecutions of indigenous healers, we found investigators very much concerned with both plant materials that they knew were ritually important, like copal incense, as well as kind of probing when a lot of these were sort of publicly performed in the street or in a household with many people watching these healing records, were using crosses in certain kinds of ways or invoking saints or beings that might be seen as heterodox or evidence of indigenous religions that were trying to be stamped out. So those kinds of sources can be particularly rich, in contrast to also at the same time that a couple of you have talked about these kind of medical recipe books that also might seemingly be stripped of their kind of maybe religious or spiritual content because of who's recording them, but they understand the plant material, but they don't necessarily write down the kind of surrounding cultural parts of these.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. So like Martha's saying, and also Paul, like the sources that are coming out of these spaces that in some ways are specifically attacking different types of medical cultures became a source base for me, and not a large one. As I was looking at indigenous medical practices and later Mexican and African American medical practices, during the 1833 cholera epidemic, when the state promoted a particular prescription that clearly incorporated indigenous healing, the physician who was promoting it wrote about indigenous spirituality in that prescription. So which while he was also denigrating it. So it became a way to I guess to begin to understand, I think, but like Paul was saying, it is tricky with these sources to fully understand that connection between plant healing and spirituality. And I also want to make the case for the WPA slave narratives, because we know that there are problems within that source space, but it's striking if you read the WPA slave narratives, how many people talk about healing practices. It's really a common thread in a lot of these interviews. And so that is a window into slave healing that is, I'd say, a rich source.
I'll quickly add that, and as Martha said before, I use extensively Inquisition records, right, as a way of getting us some of the materiality, right, of the specifically botanical elements, plants that the healers or health practitioners of African descent were using in the early modern Caribbean. And I agree completely. And this is something that, just to reiterate what Paul is saying, I think it is very dangerous trying to fill in these gaps. And there is a tendency here, like, for instance, to talk about the early, the 17th century and thinking about it in terms of what we consider to be teleological narratives or linkages that bring us to the 20th century, specifically in communities of African descent. It is easy to think about these worlds as commensurable with what anthropologists, for instance, will encounter either in Cuba or in West and West Central Africa. There is a danger here. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot recognize the importance that they had, right? And in many cases in Inquisition records, they do talk a little bit about where and how. Why is that they are going into specific places to look for these plants? And I think that is different, right? Like making claims about the political importance rather than trying to reconstruct entire cosmologies, right? Like saying, okay, there are fragments here about how and in what ways they're using and thinking about them, and the importance of the spiritual world that actually inhabits and creates a world that doesn't have this sort of differentiation between the physical and the spiritual, and this is something that Philippa was saying before. The one thing that I will say to kind of move on to the next question maybe is that we all tend to think about the writings of Europeans or Euro-Americans in the context of referring to, for instance, the practices of either indigenous people or people of African descent in this case, as always derogatory, and that depends on where they appear. In the printed records, mostly it is the case. But if you are looking at correspondence, and there is a large amount of correspondence, they will send private correspondence, they will send, for instance, Jesuit college in Cartagena de Indias, they will send back to Rome. These people are living in a world that is shaped by those concerns and is shaped by those beliefs. So they, and I'm sure this is something that Ryan, you have also found in your own work, right? Like how, and the same thing with some sort of medical records that are coming also from the Caribbean. They actually believe in not only in the practices, but also in the logics behind the uses of these botanical elements. So that is spiritually, somehow the the boundaries between the Catholic world, the world of Orthodoxy that we tend to believe existed in, for instance, Spanish America or the Spanish Caribbean. They certainly were not true for the silk conductors that were using, these healers of African descent, being them bishops, the governor. That word is much more fluid than what the printed orthodoxy of certain kinds of examinations of their God would let us to believe. So,
Eric, thank you. Did you want to say
sorry.
something? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a point just a little bit earlier that I just, as a historian of religion, I think it would be a mistake to read Anglo-American recipe or receipt books as divorced from spiritual connections. That's an artifact of the sources. They're meant to categorize or to memorialize practices that people have learned from, sometimes from reading, sometimes from other women, if it's a woman who's writing it. And it doesn't say, administer with prayer, but that would have been, not necessarily, even at the exact moment of administering it, but in conjunction with prayer. That would have been understood as a key line of defense. So I would just be careful about using that, taking that source, which is produced for a particular reason, and reading it as the sort of the extent of Anglo-American interaction with the plant world, because it would have been very likely used with in conjunction with prayer.
I'll just add, and I completely agree with what Eric said. A lot of these sort of home remedies that was almost a missionary cause to put remedies into the hands of people, simple remedies. But I'd also say this doesn't maybe fit with spirituality, but a lot of missionaries received funding by selling medicines. And so that's not maybe the spiritual connection that you're looking for, but there's a trade in medicines that funds missionary projects. And there's been a lot of great work, for example, on pharmaceuticals coming out of Halle in Germany, and then the sort of ways in which they sold those to many different audiences. But that tradition continues into the 19th century. It continues to today, honestly. You can see people selling cures for COVID, different televangelists. So that kind of connection is really important and vital to pay attention to as well.
We have a lot more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we're running short on time. So we're gonna move towards closing here. A couple of things. I'll talk about the next meeting that's coming up. But before I do, I want to ask our group of scholars here about recommendations on things they're reading. I always like to sort of ask people, what are you reading that's interesting? Sort of in the spirit of broadening our thinking about early Americas or epidemics or disease. Ask if people have recommendations, something they're reading that they would just want to recommend to an audience. We're building a bibliography, by the way. So they want to jump in with a recommendation.
Sure, I'll jump in. And this is, I mean, I'm reading this book, but it's essentially a plug for the next session of Contagious Connections at the same time, which is I really enjoyed Seth Archer's book, Sharks Upon the Land. One of the things that I think has come out of this is that epidemics aren't just about epidemics. And this is a bigger story about health, well-being, and the way health and well-being are part of social and political worlds. And in Seth's book, I think he does a great job demonstrating that health is this broader story, in his case, about colonialism in Hawaii before US annexation. And so that's my plug for both the book and the next session of Contagious Connections.
Well done, Mark. Who was next? Did I hear Martha?
Sure. I've used this really successfully in teaching, and it's been helpful in my own thinking, which is a Journal of Global History special issue from 2020. It's a special issue on pandemics that changed the world, historical reflections on COVID-19. It's a range of many essays from different places and time periods. It's also open access, so I think that can be really helpful for kind of a deep dive across time and space.
Great, thank you. Eric, were you next? There we go.
Actually, this works perfectly following up on Martha because mine is also a special issue. That's the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, Winter 2020 Forum on Epidemics. And they start, as a starting point, they go back to Charles Rosenberg's famous 1989, What is an Epidemic article. And probably the best one that I've found in that collection, I think, is Keith Whalew's Spectacles of Difference, where he sort of, I don't want to say tries to replace Rosenberg. He really wants to build on Rosenberg's, an epidemic in 4 acts kind of model and offer his own history of epidemics unfolding in a racialized way. And so it's just it's a fantastic piece. I haven't had a chance to teach it yet, but I think it would teach well in the classroom, either in conjunction with Rosenberg or not. And it's certainly widely applicable to the stuff that all of us are doing.
Thanks, Eric. Pippa, go ahead.
I'm currently just started reading Jennifer Shepard Hughes's new book, Church of the Dead, which is on the epidemic of, I wrote it down, 1576 and the birth of Christianity in the Americas. And she's a masterful storyteller and does really great work with material culture and thoughtful sort of bridging of religion and history. So highly recommend it.
Fantastic. Pablo?
So I want to recommend 2 books that I found very useful, both for teaching. One is by Seaman. It's a book that obviously it is very much present, but asks us to consider the, think about disease from the vantage point not of the 18th century enlightenment, but rather from 18th century Hippocratism, Galanism, and the construction of colonialism in the Caribbean. So that is very, very useful. And another book that I think is wonderful for thinking about the ways in which disease it is also closely linked to the conceptualization of embodiment is Rana Hogarth's Medicalizing Blackness. So another book that I've been also using lately. And if I may, kind of a third one, just real quick here is a book that it is not about the that world of the early Americas, but it asks us to think more broadly about embodiment and then the relationship between embodiment and capitalism. Is the Productive Body by François Guéry and Didier Delul, and it's a very interesting reflection on precisely the sort of narratives that we have been discussing, the relationship between capitalism, history, globalization, and how we tell the history that we tell.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pablo. Paul, any suggestions? What are you reading? Things you'd recommend?
Oh boy, I will have a teaching suggestion. And I'm teaching, I think a lot of us are now teaching history of epidemics and so forth. But this semester teaching global history of human health, which is actually a course that I intended to teach before the pandemic. The pandemic finally inspired me to teach it. And I've been having them watch the PBS series Extra Life. It's narrated by Stephen Johnson, the author of Ghost Map on Jon Snow and cholera. And it was filmed during COVID. So, and David Olusoga from Oxford is also the co-narrator. Students love it. It's a kind of more of a, it's progressive narrative, which I think a lot of these things are, but they do talk about health disparities and so forth. But there's a lot of talking points in there, and the students love it. So if you're teaching the course, the only caveat is they probably have to subscribe to donate $5 a month to PBS to watch it, but that's cheaper than a textbook.
A great cause. Thank you all for those recommendations. I think Martha Howard has captured them in chat, and we'll save the chat recommendations. We are building a bibliography. We are reconvening on December 17th with some of the folks mentioned here, with Seth Archer and Erica Charters and Mariola Espinosa and Jim Rice and Cristobal Silva and Reina Hogarth, to sort of follow up on this conversation and have a similar type conversation about thinking about epidemic diseases in the vast early Americas. I want to thank our discussants, our scholars here, Martha, Pippa, Mark, Pablo, Paul, and Eric, for joining. We're really thrilled to have you here. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. We look forward to being in touch very soon. So thank you all very much, and thanks to the audience for attention here today. Thanks, everybody. We're going to wrap up here. We'll hopefully see you on December 17th.